Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We're now in our second season and more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. We look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for today's show on waste and waste management, its effects on health and environment, specifically talking about health impacts of waste, improper and inadequate disposal. Now, the generation of waste and the collection, processing, transport, and disposal of waste is a process of waste management. And it's important for both the health of the public and the aesthetic and environmental reasons. Waste is basically anything discarded by an individual, household, or an organization. As a result, waste is a complex mixture of different substances, some of which are naturally and substantially hazardous to our health. The potential health effects of both waste itself and the consequences of managing it have been the subject of a vast body of research. Virtually every resident, organization, and human activity in this country and the world generates some type of waste. And the amount of waste produced is influenced by economic activity, consumption, and population growth. Developed societies, such as the United States, generally produce large amounts of municipal solid waste. In fact, among industrialized nations, the U.S. generates the largest amount of municipal solid waste per individual on a daily basis. Waste generation, in most cases, really represents an inefficient use of the materials available to us. And once generated, waste must be managed through reuse, recycling, storage, treatment, and or disposals. And our current approaches to waste management have evolved primarily due to health concerns as well as the need to control odors. In the past, waste often was just deposited on land outside of developed areas or outside of the cities. Now, here today to start us out and help us explore and unpack how and why waste and waste management is handled and how it affects us is James Isenee. James is a senior consulting engineer in the Environmental Risk Business Unit with the RPS Group. James has 36 years' experience as a consultant involved in the planning, permitting, design, and construction administration of a broad range of civil and environmental projects. Environmental engineering and project management projects have been the principal focus of James' career for the last 31 years. This experience includes areas of municipal and industrial waste management, water resources, environmental audits and management systems, as well as regulatory compliance and enforcement. And James hails to us today from my hometown of Austin, Texas. Welcome, James. We're so glad you could be with us today.
I'm glad to be here.
Now, James, can you start us out by telling us what are some of the primary objectives of waste management or any waste management system?
Well, in terms of landfills, which is my specialty, it is the safe disposition of wastes in a particular location has minimal impact or as little impact as possible on human health.
And the environment.
Yes.
Which, even though that's more specifically related to, from your work, landfills, I have to think that's about the main objective of any waste disposal for the most part. James, I've heard, and most of us have heard of solid waste or municipal waste, Then there's liquid waste, there's medical waste, there's human waste, industrial waste, and e-waste. Can you explain to us these various types of waste, and how do we dispose of each, and what are some of the types of waste management for some of these categories?
Well, the ideal situation is where you recycle as much as possible, recycle before going into landfills. And of course, I'm sure there's some final waste products that do end up in a landfill.
As we were talking about, municipal solid waste seems to be the most proliferous of waste. What is the difference in municipal solid waste and waste that goes into the landfill?
Municipal solid waste is what goes into municipal solid waste landfills. There are various kinds of landfills. There's ones for hazardous waste. There are ones for municipal solid waste. And there's non-hazardous industrial landfills, which can be commercial or private. Most landfills are regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. Mm-hmm. And it was put into effect originally in 1980, and it didn't do a lot. It banned all open dump waste sites. So you could no longer dump any kind of waste, including hazardous waste, on the ground. And it covers hazardous waste and municipal solid waste and coal combustion residual landfills.
I know of a lot of interest to people. What are generally the regulations about where landfills can be placed, or can landfills be placed anywhere we so desire?
No, they cannot. When you go to get a permit, while there's federal regulations, most states have been delegated the authority to enforce those regulations, and they basically have copied them and have their own state regulations, federal ones. And one of the very important that you have to take into account is siting. So that is in the permitting process, which for most landfills can be challenged by the public when somebody submits a permit application, and they are always challenged to permit applications. So siting, that's a very important part of permitting a landfill.
Jay, as an expert in the development and building of landfills, can you tell us how they're built, and really briefly, why communities should feel safe and comfortable living near them?
All righty. Well, they have composite liners, meaning a clay liner overlain by a plastic liner. And on top of that, a permeable layer called a leachate collection layer. And leachate is the liquid that drains through the waste and hits the bottom of the landfill, and it is taken out. After the waste reach final elevations, they put a similar liner on top of it. That is the basic design of a landfill. And then the collection of any water that does get through the waste is managed.
Landfills aren't the only way to dispose of waste. I know this is your specialty, but what are some of the other options out there? And are there any interesting or new trends on the horizon?
Well, there's recycling. There's waste reduction. After the hazardous waste rules came into effect in the early 80s, the volume of hazardous waste went way down. There's also incineration. Those are ways that you can reduce the amount of waste that goes into landfills.
I find it hard to believe that modern society and all its technology and its knowledge cannot find some better ways.
There are better ways, but typically things are like waste. You look for the cheapest way of handling it. Now, that is landfilling often. You can spend a little bit of additional money and start recycling. So it can be done. I'm pretty confident as we go along in the future, and it's already started happening. I remember when there was no recycling, and now there is a lot of organized recycling efforts, and that has an impact on how much waste gets put in landfills.
Indeed, and Austin is doing something else. My mother lives there. They keep going up substantially every year on the landfill dumping fees, and that will help. What you mentioned, the fact that the cost is low, that's why people do it. Thank you so much for this helpful information, James, and helping us to understand this more. We've been with James Isenee, a consulting engineer in the Environmental Risk Business Unit with the RPS Group. Thank you so much. And we're going to move on to talk more now about the health aspects of waste management and waste disposal with Dr. David Carpenter. Thank you again, James.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the green, healthy, and sustainable living authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Markets, sunflower shops, and many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And Lynn Dental Care is our other sponsor, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. We are back now talking about waste management, effects on health and environment, specifically talking about health impacts of waste, improper and inadequate disposal. And now we want to focus more so to the health perspective. The effects associated with waste, of course, vary widely, and they are influenced by the substances or chemicals found in waste and how those are managed. And, of course, the management of waste may also result in waste and chemicals in waste entering into our environment. Hazardous waste, by definition, has the potential to negatively affect human health and the environment, which is why it is so strictly regulated. Hazardous waste are either specifically listed as hazardous by the EPA or state, or they exhibit one of more of the following characteristics: ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, or toxicity. Generation and management of waste and waste products can contaminate land, air, water, and thus negatively affect human health and environmental conditions. Here today to help us understand this a lot more and to help us unpack it is Dr. David O. Carpenter. Dr. Carpenter is a public health physician who serves as director of the Institute of Health and the Environment, which is a collaborating center of the World Health Organization. As well, he is a professor of environmental health sciences at the University of Albany's School of Public Health. Dr. Carpenter previously served as director of the Wadsworth Center of the New York State Department of Health and as dean of the University of Albany School of Public Health. David, who received his medical degree at Harvard Medical School, has more than 435 peer-reviewed publications, 6 books, and 50 reviews and book chapters to his credit. So he's a real expert. Welcome, Dr. Carpenter. We are so excited you could be with us today, and if you don't mind, I'm going to call you David.
Please do.
Thank you. David, starting out, how do waste generation, waste disposal, and waste management connect with or intersect with public health, and why should people care about it?
Well, as you said in the introduction, there are many different chemicals that are put in these hazardous waste sites. And different chemicals have different ways of getting off of the waste site into people. And they are hazardous, so it's very dangerous when they get into people. Some of the chemicals are volatile. They go into the air. We all breathe 24/7. And if you live near one of these hazardous waste sites, you can be breathing those chemicals all of the time. Others are not so volatile, but they may be water soluble. And if the waste site is not constructed properly, they can leach into the groundwater. That's not so much of a problem for people that are on municipal water supplies, but people in the country that have wells can then be drinking water that's highly contaminated with dangerous chemicals. And of course, there are a variety of different kinds of health effects, everything from effects on the brain and cognition to chemicals causing cancer, to chemicals causing respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, changing our immune system, a whole host of things. And I've been studying some of these factors for a number of years.
Primarily, they have been addressing those chemicals affecting or getting into our water system. What about other ways we would come in contact with some of those hazardous wastes, like playgrounds or being in recreational areas or things of that nature?
Well, these chemicals, before they get put in a landfill, they come from various places in our everyday life. And of course, that's a very dangerous thing when they're on the playgrounds, when kids are getting their hands in dirt that's contaminated with dangerous chemicals, putting their hands in their mouth, that kind of thing. Now, most of my work, in fact, has been focused on people that live near a hazardous waste site where the major route of exposure is breathing the air for those chemicals that go into the air. Now, a lot of those we call them as volatile organic chemicals, and they're the common ones. They're the things that are in gasoline, benzene, butadiene. These are known human carcinogens. And we're all exposed to them to some degree. They're present from automobile exhaust. But if you put a lot of benzene in a hazardous waste site, it's a volatile chemical. So it doesn't stay put. It goes into the air. And the wind spreads it around the community. And people that live near that waste site are going to be breathing in benzene. That's going to increase the risk of cancer, several specific kinds of cancer that we know about. It's going to have other effects on their hematopoietic system, their blood cells. It has adverse effects on their liver function and can cause all kinds of problems.
Where's the benzene coming from that is typically dumped into the hazardous waste site?
Well, benzene is found in gasoline, in natural gas, in oils, but it's also manufactured at incredible amounts because it's a very useful chemical for many synthetic processes. So there's some in nature and there's a lot that's man-made. But as with many of these things that are useful and common, there's always some that's wasted. And that's what ends up in the hazardous waste sites.
What would be some of the common household waste products or waste disposal elements with benzene?
Well, with benzene, in the normal household, you wouldn't have so many waste products. Now, if you are burning coal, you're going to get some benzene formed. And this is one of the problems with these power plants. You're burning these fuels. Some of them contain benzene, and sometimes benzene is formed in the process of combustion. And you'd like to capture it all from the smokestack, but that doesn't often happen, and you get some released. So within the home, the primary source of benzene is probably just the gas stove. But there could be other things. Benzene is often present in household solvents, not at high concentrations, but there are anything that is a solvent has got these volatile organic chemicals in them. Most of them are not as dangerous as benzene is, but you have toluene, xylene, ethylbenzene, you have other compounds that, while they may not be as dangerous as benzene, they have some of the same adverse health effects, and they go into the air. And so if they're in the air, we breathe them in. They would much rather be in our body than in the air. Because they're fat soluble, they're easily absorbed through the lung, and that is the way that people are exposed to these chemicals.
Earlier, our guest was telling us and describing some of the various types of waste that are disposed. And the types you were discussing just now, ethyl benzene, benzene, sound to me like something that would be more industrial in nature or something associated with construction?
Yes, they're associated with a lot of industries.
Okay.
And, rarely would they be disposed of in big barrels in a hazardous waste landfill. But because they're so widely used in industry, they often end up in landfills. The most dangerous thing of benzene is cancer.
Okay.
And that is a very dangerous. Leukemia, lymphoma, the blood cancers are very dangerous. They hit kids as well as adults. And that's by far the most dangerous part of benzene exposure. And we're particularly concerned about children because leukemia and those diseases are common diseases of children. And having cancer in a child is a very devastating thing. Even though we can treat leukemia reasonably well, it is devastating to the family. Often the treatment involves stunting of the growth of the child and lifelong disability that should be avoided if at all possible.
During the time we have been doing the Healthy Living, Healthy Planet radio show, one of the things that's really come to the forefront is that children are very much front and center in that vulnerable population. We've got the low income and minorities who are vulnerable, but children are just as vulnerable, if perhaps not more so, because of their size and their age. Going back to what you see as perhaps the most harmful waste or waste product in terms of the largest number of people perhaps coming in contact with it and experiencing or having the potential to experience its health impact?
Well, my work has focused on these volatile organics and also the semi-volatile organics. Those are things like PCBs and DDT that they're not as volatile as benzene, but they're more dangerous. And they also can cause a host of diseases. They're carcinogens, they affect our brain, they affect our heart, they increase the risk of diabetes. And so the magnitude of health effects of some of those semi-volatile compounds is very concerning. They also spread further in the air. While benzene doesn't travel so far because sunlight destroys it, but these other chemicals can travel for miles coming into the air from a waste site.
That's a lot. And we're going to continue this conversation on the other side of the break. We've been with Dr. David O. Carpenter with the University of Albany, and he serves as director of the Institute for Health and the Environment, which is a collaborating center of the World Health Organization. Thank you, David. We'll be back with you on the other side.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to our show on waste and waste management, effects on health and the environment. And we are back with Dr. David O. Carpenter, who is giving us a lot of important information on the health impacts that we come in contact with as it relates to waste products, and waste management. And again, thank you so much for being with us today, David.
My pleasure.
You had been quoted as saying that to the extent to which toxic landfill contaminants suppress the immune system has been underestimated. And I think that most ordinary people in their everyday lives have no idea of this. So can you connect the dots for our listener? Help them to understand how the contaminants in the landfills very specifically get to be a health hazard for them, or how it's specifically affecting their health?
Well, landfills contain many different chemicals. And what we have done in trying to answer the question you're posing is characterize landfills if they contain persistent organic chemicals. And that would include things like polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, DDT, chlorinated pesticides. There are newer persistent chemicals like the brominated flame retardants, the perfluorinated compounds that came from Scotchgard and Teflon and things like that. And in contrast, we characterized landfills that had volatile organic compounds or landfills that had other chemicals. Now, I've been particularly interested in inhalation of chemicals. Now, lead and mercury are very toxic, but they don't go into the air except if they're bound to particles. So you don't really breathe them in. These semi-volatile chemicals that are persistent, we've known that they've been toxic for a long time, and most of them are no longer manufactured. And we've known that they do contaminate our food supply, and everybody thought that was the major route of exposure. I think what my colleagues and I have been arguing is that they are semi-volatile, and when we dispose of them in a hazardous waste site, they don't stay there. They slowly go into the air, and people that live nearby breathe them in. So that the studies we've done have been looking at different diseases in people that live near a hazardous waste site containing these persistent organic chemicals, as compared to people that live in a waste site that has other chemicals, or they live in an area where there's no hazardous waste site nearby. And what we are finding is a striking elevation in a whole series of diseases in people that live near these waste sites with the persistent organics. Now, of course, one has to adjust for things like poverty, household income, how much do people smoke, how much exercise do they get, what's their diet like. There are a whole variety of factors that influence health. But when we've adjusted for those factors to the best of our ability, not perfectly, but to the best of our ability, we find elevations in cancer, elevations in high blood pressure, elevations in heart attacks, in diabetes, and to get really to the question you asked, elevations in pneumonia, in respiratory infections, in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and in admission to hospitals for chronic bronchitis. So something in these waste sites is suppressing the immune system and making for more infections. And when you have the infections, it makes them worse. Now, of course, this is particularly timely right now because of our concern of COVID-19 and efforts to avoid being infected. Well, if you're infected, the first line of defense is your immune system. We've known for many, many years that chemicals like PCBs suppress the immune system. In the populations that are exposed, especially in children, we see more ear infections, more respiratory infections. Even in animals, it's been studied in polar bears, in mink, in sheep and goats. If they're exposed to these chemicals, they're more vulnerable to having infectious disease.
Indeed. I have to think that whenever that time arrives that we are past the current COVID epidemic and researchers begin to do some after-event research report and statistics, I have to think that we may be able to see some correlation between people living near or people who've had exposure to some of these hazardous chemicals and those who either caught or had the worst experience with COVID, since they both seem to attack the lung and the respiratory system.
We already have very convincing evidence that people that are exposed to air pollution at higher levels are more seriously affected when they are infected with the COVID virus. So, air pollution is going to damage the lung. It does so in a whole variety of ways. And again, air pollution is a variety of different chemicals. They're the particles, they're the metals that are bound to the particles, there are the volatile organics, and even the semi-volatile organics that are breathed in, captured by the lung, and that suppresses the immune system. And it also directly damages the lung. And so we know that the major effect of COVID-19 infection is pneumonia. And so if you already have a damaged lung, of course, you're going to be more seriously impacted if you were infected with the virus.
So many of these environmental issues and impacts are interrelated and build upon each other for sure. Let me ask you this. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about PCBs before the break, that PCBs and DDTs are no longer made, but they're still around. Apparently they last a very, very, very long time. But how do they end up in our landfills? Can you explain that to us?
Well, we're still using them, even though they haven't been made since the late 70s.
Okay.
But the EPA, when they banned the use of PCBs in their manufacture in the late 70s, they didn't ban the use when they were in an enclosed environment, as in transformers and capacitors. Now, everything decays over time, and so some of these old transformers and capacitors have been leaking recently. I've been very much involved in studies in schools. Now, every fluorescent light, or at least the old fluorescent lights, had a little capacitor in the fluorescent light, and that capacitor was filled with PCBs. And schools that were built before the late 70s, many of these old schools haven't changed the fluorescent light fixtures since that time. And they're still there, they're leaking, and they're getting into the air, and children in schools are breathing them, and teachers and staff are breathing them. And PCBs are known human carcinogens. They also reduce cognitive function. So the last thing you want to have in a school is a chemical in the air that students are breathing that's going to make them learn less well. And yet that's true in so many places in our environment.
So basically, the older structures, older buildings have the greatest propensity to put all of us in contact with the highly hazardous PCBs.
Absolutely correct.
Indeed, new information for us. Last thing, very quickly, what advice can you give to ordinary people in their everyday lives as it relates to perhaps protecting themselves or how they can drive solutions as it relates to the health impact of waste disposal?
Well, one of the really difficult issues that comes from our work shows that it is actually dangerous to your health to live near a hazardous waste site. Now, this is a real problem because we have positioned these hazardous waste sites in a number of areas, a number of urban areas, and I think this is an issue for government and regulators. Waste sites should be put as far away from people as possible. We should do everything we can to reduce the volume of our waste, but when we dispose of it, we should not think that just because it's put in a landfill someplace, we don't have to worry about it any longer, because that's not the case.
It's important, too, that people have this information, which, of course, is why Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio exists. Because one of the things I've seen recently is brand spanking new housing communities or residential communities being built across the street or across the highway from a landfill. I know better than to move there, so people need to know that that's is potentially hazardous to their health.
Exactly.
So again, this is this knowledge that's power. Thank you so much. We've been with Dr. David Carpenter, who has really helped us understand these health impacts a lot more. And again, that's what this radio show is about, is showing people that to be concerned and to know about environmental issues is not an option. It's actually a must, because it does affect our world, and more importantly, it affects our health. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, promoting environmental awareness through expo, conferences, film festival, interactive experiences, and now EarthX streaming TV. Our other sponsor is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the green, healthy, and sustainable living authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. And we are back with today's episode on waste management, effects on health and environment, and specifically we're looking at health impacts of waste, improper and inadequate disposal. And we have a special treat today with our Pulse of the Community segment. We have with us Danielle McClelland, who is manager of the City of Dallas's Zero Waste program. Danielle is responsible for implementation of the City of Dallas's multifamily recycling ordinance, for implementation of zero waste components in Dallas's local solid waste management plan, and oversight of environmental compliance, education, and outreach, all to support Dallas's zero waste, stormwater management, air quality, urban agriculture, sustainability, and water conservation mandates and programs. So we are excited to have Danielle to join us and help us unpack, especially on the local level, unpack this whole area of some of the things that are going on the ground as it relates to waste and waste management. Thank you so much, Danielle. Welcome, and we're so glad you could be with us today.
Thank you for having me and for the opportunity to share with your listeners.
Danielle, the City of Dallas's Zero Waste program seems to have a very wide scope, and it throws a very large net across what appears to be a lot of environment and sustainability-related components. Can you tell us about that? What actually is the City of Dallas's Zero Waste program, what it involves, and what are your department's goals?
Well, Bernice, you make an excellent point. The City of Dallas's Zero Waste Plan, which is our nickname for it, is actually our local solid waste management plan. And you're absolutely right. It touches on all aspects of waste management in the City of Dallas. So we get into, the plan gets into things like not only existing programs, like our recycling program, but also proposed programs to help reduce the volume of waste that's generated and disposed in Dallas. And so the plan is divided, as it currently stands, into three sections that have targets for each of those milestones, if you will. So our first milestone we met in 2020, or I should say 2020 was our first milestone, and the goal for that milestone was to achieve a 40% diversion rate by the year 2020. The local solid waste management plan, or our zero waste plan, was adopted by the Dallas City Council in 2013, and we unfortunately did not meet that goal of 40% landfill diversion based on that 2013 diversion or disposal rate, I should say. And so as the City Council was nearing 2020, we started looking at what our diversion rate was, and at that time it was hovering right around 18%. Diversion, and that's materials that are picked up by the City of Dallas and disposed of at the landfill. And there were some primary drivers that would need to change in order for us to get closer to our targeted goal. First, we realized that we could not just measure what the city was picking up and disposing in the landfill or diverting from the landfill, but we needed to also consider what our private enterprises also doing in Dallas, because again, we're looking at a citywide goal of everybody who lives and works in Dallas, not just those folks who get their garbage and recycling picked up by the City of Dallas. And so through a lot of stakeholder engagement and a lot of political input, honestly, the City of Dallas adopted a multifamily recycling ordinance to require those who operate multifamily communities, apartment communities, dorms, group homes, that sort of thing in Dallas, if they have 8 or more households or 8 or more housing units, to offer access to recycling service. We found that through analysis and through communication with our partners in the Greater Dallas Apartment Association, that many apartment communities were not offering access to recycling. And in a city like Dallas of well over 1 million people, more than half of our residents, or a good number of our residents, lived in multifamily properties. And so we saw access to recycling for people who live in multifamily properties to be a great and a very important first step in increasing our diversion from the landfill. The way the plan was structured in 2013, again, was to look at not only voluntary programs and education and outreach to existing customers, but also looking at possibly mandates, as well as looking at new technologies that would help increase our diversion. And so when we talk about mandates, that multifamily recycling ordinance did become a mandate under the existing law, but there's also written into the current plan a review of our progress and, if necessary, updates to the plan. And so right now, Dallas is in the midst of updating our local solid waste management plan, again, nicknamed our Zero Waste Plan. We're in the process of updating that, and we are working now on a plan to solicit public feedback and engagement on what that plan should include for Dallas, because we know that our landscape, if you will, in solid waste has really changed a lot in the last several years. And so we want to make sure that we have a plan that's reflective of those changes, but also keeps us on the path towards progress so that we're able to basically dispose of less waste in our landfill.
We were talking earlier with a landfill consultant from Austin who actually develops these, and we were also talking with a professor out of University of Albany who was also telling us a number of things. So hopefully we got over to our listeners too, is that landfills are not things we want to promote, but as you all are doing, they're things we want to decrease and eliminate ultimately. But a couple of things I want to dive a little bit deeper into that you had talked about, and that was, what was the percentage of solid waste that your goal is to divert from the landfills in the area again?
So under Zero Waste, our ultimate goal was to achieve a larger diversion over what we initially had. And so that would be an 85% diversion is what Dallas considers zero waste. Again, it's not entirely zero because we know we can't get rid of everything. But our ultimate and our long-term goal is to get to an 85% diversion rate. Our first target, or our first milestone towards reaching that goal, was set again in 2013 at a 40% diversion rate, and we are not there. We are not yet close after a year now of our multifamily recycling ordinance being in place. Mm-hmm. Once we get the annual reports from the recycling collectors who have been permitted to pick up that recyclable material from multifamily properties in Dallas and provide us that data, we're hoping to be able to update that number. But our analysis shows that the greatest way to make an impact, besides making sure that everyone who lives in Dallas has access to recycling in their homes, is to divert our brush and organic material from the landfill.
I want to make sure people understand this, that the goal for the city of Dallas is to divert approximately all of it, 85% of it, and then we can say we have reached zero waste. But I want people to understand what that's talking about. That includes the waste that the garbage collector collects from our garbage cans in our alleyways, and that's where people come in, because I don't think they think about it, or they think this is not relevant to us. So when we talk about waste, is that the larger part? What percentage of our personal waste that goes in our garbage cans that they collect, about what percentage is that of our total overall waste that we're talking about that we're trying to divert?
The bulk of it is, for Dallas, is organic material, brush and bulk trash or brush trash. We live in a verdant area that is lovely. We've got trees, and periodically, nature comes through and the trees get trimmed naturally, or they get trimmed because we're trimming them. But that brush waste is the largest source of organic material that goes into our landfill. And so if we can get our arms around that, we're gonna leapfrog beyond what we are able to do by diverting what goes into those roll carts.
But I want people to understand this too, because we people, humans, residents, are creating a great deal, if not most, of that bulk waste. Because I know every month on bulk pickup day, I'm putting stuff out there. And as you mentioned, the weather involuntarily puts a great deal of it out there at least once a year. And even right now, my yard people just raked the yard completely about 2 weeks ago. Now it's full again. So we, too, are responsible for that in terms of our habits and what we do. So the bulk of it is the brush and the yard waste. And then what would be next?
So after brush and yard waste, and when we talk about brush and yard waste, we're talking about tree limbs, we're talking about trees, we're talking about shrubbery that's come out, we're talking about leaves especially. So what we want to do is encourage folks to, as much as possible, try to find reuse within your yard for how you use that. So we want to encourage folks to do backyard composting, to do home composting, to mulch those leaves back into the ground. That provides vital nutrients to the soil, and you'd be amazed how much better your lawn would be if you didn't just throw away all of the nutrients that are available to your yard through leaves and grass clippings.
And time flies, Danielle. We only have about a minute left. So we want you to be able to get out there in terms of what you think is very important for people to know and to do as it relates to us moving towards zero waste. So you've got the last minute, Danielle.
So for the last minute, I'd really want to encourage everyone to go back to the basics, go back to the 3 R's. There are more of them now in some circles, but if you would think about reducing the amount of waste that you generate, reuse the things that you can reuse so that you don't have to buy them again and eventually throw them away again. Recycle those items that are recyclable. And the 4th R that I love the most is repair. We live in an era, in a society where if something breaks, we just get a new one. We don't even try to fix it. Try to fix those things. It not only saves you money, but it saves our environment and it saves landfill space, which is so important. I know your other guests have covered that.
Indeed. And thank you so much, Danielle, for being with us today. We've been with Danielle McClelland, who's manager of the City of Dallas Zero Waste Program. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day, like yourselves. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up one way or the other to the change that we each live through. This is Bernice Butler. Thank you so much, and join us again next week for more on waste and waste management. Thank you for listening.